The year is 30 BC. The sweltering heat of August hangs over Alexandria, heavy with the scent of salt, smoke, and impending doom. The war is over. The fleets are broken, and the last pharaoh of Egypt sits in the terrifying silence of her own mausoleum, listening to the rhythmic, iron-shod footsteps of men who have not come to kill her, but to inventory her. Cleopatra did not die the moment Egypt fell. She lived through the suffocating bureaucratic nightmare that came after. When Roman soldiers breached the royal district, they didn't kick down doors with swords drawn in a frenzy of bloodlust. They arrived with wax tablets, styluses, and a terrifying sense of order. In August of 30 BC, the most famous woman in history ceased to be a monarch and became an asset, a high-value item to be cataloged, secured, and prepared for transport. The doors to her chambers were sealed not with rubble, but with Roman administrative wax. Guards were stationed at every threshold, their eyes not scanning for assassins, but watching her chest rise and fall, ensuring the property of Rome remained undamaged. Messengers were screened, objects were tagged, and the air in the palace grew stale. Her captivity was not a sudden violent end. It was a slow, calculated asphyxiation. What happened in those final weeks was not a romantic tragedy of poison and serpents. It was a systematic process designed to achieve something far worse than death. On August 1st, 30 BC, the legions of Octavian entered Alexandria. The city, known for its chaotic vibrancy and the roar of its markets, surrendered with an eerie quiet. There was no siege, no battering rams splintering the gates, no fires consuming the great library. The transition was surgical. Cleopatra remained inside her palace, surrounded by the gold and marble she had known all her life. But the ownership of the very air she breathed had shifted. The palace was no longer a seat of Ptolemaic power. It was a holding facility. Roman centurions marched in formation through the colonnades, their hobnail boots grinding into the mosaic floors. They occupied the space with a terrifying indifference. Entrances were reassigned, interior routes were mapped, and the geography of her life was redrawn by foreign soldiers. Rooms where she had once plotted empires were now sealed off. Others were cleared of furniture to create clear lines of sight for the sentries. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, described this occupation not as a chaotic imprisonment, but as specimen management. Sentries were placed at specific intervals, creating a grid of surveillance from which there was no escape. Soldiers were under strict orders to prevent any act of self-harm, not out of mercy, but because a dead captive has no value in a triumph. Dio Cassius notes the humiliating intimacy of this new regime. Food was inspected before delivery, loaves of bread torn open to check for hidden messages or poisons. Sharp objects were confiscated from her vanity. Polished bronze mirrors were removed. Even her cosmetics, the tools she used to craft her public image, were searched and sifted through by rough, callous hands. This was not merely detention. It was a dismantling of a queen. Cleopatra was allowed to move, but only within designated zones of permission. She could speak to her attendants, but only if those attendants had been vetted and approved by a Roman prefect. She could request a change of clothes, but only if the request was logged and the items cleared. The palace still held her belongings. Her ornate furniture remained in place. Her silk robes hung in the wardrobes, but the context of these objects had changed. They were no longer hers. She was simply being allowed to use Roman property until further notice. Outside the walls, Alexandria continued to function with a jarring normality. The grain shipments that fed Rome were processed at the docks. The temples opened for morning prayers, and Roman administrators began the dry work of cataloging tax records and mapping property boundaries. Inside the palace, time had pooled into a stagnant lake. Cleopatra was not tortured on a rack. She was maintained like a rare exotic beast. Days bled into nights without resolution. She sent formal requests to meet with Octavian, desperate to negotiate terms for her children. These requests were acknowledged with a nod, a scribble on a scroll, but never answered. Letters were delivered into the hands of intermediaries, but the responses were perpetually delayed. This delay was a weapon. Roman power operated through the total control of time. Outcomes were determined not by outright refusal, but by the agonizing management of the clock. Every unanswered message reinforced the crushing reality that she could no longer initiate action. Her daily routine, once filled with the governance of an empire that stretched from Syria to Cyrenaica, was now structured by absence. Meals arrived at irregular intervals, keeping her off balance. Attendants were rotated without pattern, so she could form no alliances. The palace became a labyrinth of restriction. The layout she had known for 21 years was reorganized. She was a stranger in her own home. Cleopatra was a woman of immense intellect. She spoke 9 languages, had negotiated face-to-face with Julius Caesar, commanded naval fleets, and managed the complex economy of the Nile. But in this new Roman reality, her genius was rendered obsolete. She could not negotiate with guards whose only vocabulary was obedience. She could not command soldiers who viewed her as a spoil of war. She could not leverage relationships with a Senate that had declared her an enemy of the state. Every tool of statecraft she possessed, persuasion, alliance, financial leverage, had been stripped away. All that remained was her physical body, and Rome had calculated the exact market value of that asset. While she sat under guard, listening to the Mediterranean waves crash against the harbor walls, Rome was already rewriting her identity. This process of erasure had begun years prior. After the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's propaganda machine had systematically dismantled her reputation. Official documents in Rome ceased to use her royal titles. Public speeches referred to her not as a monarch, but as a foreign influence, a sorceress who had corrupted the noble Mark Antony. Coins stopped bearing her strong, aquiline profile. Written accounts began to emphasize seduction over statecraft, painting her as a whore rather than a strategist. Her capture did not create this narrative. It finalized it for the Roman mob. Cleopatra was no longer the descendant of the Ptolemies or the co-regent who had stabilized a fractured dynasty. She was a trophy. Roman law required physical evidence for a triumph. Victory was not declared. It was demonstrated. Enemies were presented in a strict sequence. First their captured weapons, then their looted treasures, and finally their leaders in chains. Cleopatra was being preserved in position 6, last among the captives, ensuring the crowd's anticipation reached a fever pitch. But the process required her transformation from a ruler into an exhibit. This transformation was enacted through language. Roman officials in the palace stopped addressing her as Your Majesty. Messages referred to her simply as the Egyptian or the woman. Diplomatic protocols were replaced with the callous instructions used for handling livestock. Inside the royal quarters, this reclassification had physical consequences. Items associated with her administrative power were the first to be removed. Her royal seals, used to authorize grain shipments and laws, were confiscated. Ceremonial objects were cataloged and packed into crates. Official correspondence was collected and burned or filed. What remained were her personal effects, but even these were violated. Her jewelry was inventoried, each gemstone held up to the light by a soldier estimating its price in denarii. Her clothing was inspected for hidden pockets. The distinction between what was personal and what was state property was being decided by Roman assessors while she watched. She stood in the corner of her own room, observing the categorization of her life, unable to speak a word of protest that would matter. On August 3rd, 30 BC, 2 days after the occupation began, the silence was broken. Cleopatra was granted an audience with Octavian. This was not a meeting of equals. It was an inspection. The meeting took place inside her palace, but the room had been aggressively cleared. Guards stood like statues at every entrance, their hands resting on the hilts of their gladius swords. The furniture had been rearranged to place her in a position of supplication. Octavian entered not with generals or advisors, but with scribes. The meeting was being documented for the archives. Ancient sources provide fragments of this desperate encounter. Cleopatra, her hair likely unkempt and her eyes dark with exhaustion, reportedly attempted to justify her alliance with Mark Antony. She presented financial records, trying to prove her utility to Rome. She offered access to the royal treasuries, hoping to buy safety. She proposed terms for her children's lives. Octavian, a man known for his icy demeanor, simply listened. He did not refuse her requests. He did not accept them. He merely acknowledged them with a terrifying lack of emotion. Then he left. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No agreements were signed. No promises were made. But the meeting served its purpose. It confirmed that Cleopatra still believed negotiation was possible. As long as she believed she could talk her way out, she would remain compliant. She would not try to escape. She would wait. And waiting was exactly what Rome needed her to do, because every day she waited was another day they could prepare the ships for her final journey. After the meeting, Plutarch records that Cleopatra believed she had made progress. She interpreted Octavian's restraint as clemency, but Octavian's restraint was merely scheduling. He had already determined her fate. He simply hadn't shared the timeline. Cleopatra's position had never rested solely on her own authority. It rested on succession. Her eldest son, Caesar Ion, publicly acknowledged as the biological child of Julius Caesar, represented a geopolitical nightmare that Rome could not allow to exist. His very bloodline threatened Octavian's claim to power. If Julius Caesar had a legitimate heir, Octavian was nothing more than a pretender. Caesar Ion was 17 years old in 30 BC. Before the city fell, Cleopatra had sent him south toward the Red Sea with a fortune in coin and instructions to flee to India, but he was recalled. Sources conflict on whether he was betrayed by his tutor or intercepted by Roman cavalry, but the outcome is certain. He was executed shortly after the fall of Alexandria. The other children were treated differently. Cleopatra had 3 younger children with Mark Antony: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were taken into Roman custody alive. They were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They were reassigned assets. Roman practice did not automatically execute the children of defeated enemies. It absorbed them. They were destined to be transported to Rome, placed in households, and raised under Roman supervision to become compliant symbols of conquest. But for Cleopatra, this was presented as a removal of her last leverage. Her children would survive, but not as Egyptians, not as Ptolemies. They were gradually separated from her. Octavian accelerated the preparations. Ships were commissioned. Transport cages were built. But Cleopatra was kept in the dark. She was held in a state of procedural uncertainty because uncertainty prevents planning. On August 10th, 30 BC, approximately 10 days after the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra made her move. The method of her death remains one of history's great debates. Ancient sources provide conflicting, often theatrical accounts. Plutarch describes an asp hidden in a basket of figs, smuggled past the guards. Dio Cassius suggests a poison needle. Strabo notes that no snake was ever found. Some historians propose a hollow hairpin filled with toxin. Others suggest she may have bribed a guard. The mechanism is uncertain, but the context is not. Cleopatra died before she could be dragged onto a Roman ship. When the guards broke down the door and found her body, perhaps draped in her royal regalia, perhaps slumped on a simple couch, they found her handmaidens dying beside her. Rome's response to this defiance reveals exactly what her captivity had been designed to achieve. When informed of her death, Octavian did not cancel the triumph. He simply adjusted the presentation. On August 13th, 29 BC, nearly 1 year after her death, Octavian celebrated his triple triumph in Rome. For the Egyptian conquest, Cleopatra appeared not in person, but as an image. Plutarch records that a large, grotesque effigy of Cleopatra was carried through the streets. It depicted her lying on a couch with an asp clinging to her arm. The representation was sufficient. Roman law did not require the warm body of an enemy, only verifiable evidence of their defeat. The effigy was, in many ways, better than the woman. A living Cleopatra could have screamed, could have refused to walk, could have looked the crowd in the eye and unsettled them. A wax doll was controllable. It was predictable, but the effigy was not alone. Walking in the shadow of their mother's wax corpse were her 3 surviving children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, weighed down by heavy chains, were paraded through the dust of Rome. They were not harmed physically. They were used as evidence that Egypt was not merely conquered, but absorbed. The crowds cheering for Octavian saw a carefully constructed narrative. The effigy showed Cleopatra in death, defeated, dramatic, contained. The children showed Egypt's future, Roman, manageable, integrated. After the triumph, the children were reassigned to the household of Octavia, Octavian's sister and Mark Antony's former wife. They were raised in Rome, educated in Latin, and folded into the aristocracy. Cleopatra Selene was later married to Juba II, the Roman-appointed king of Mauritania. She would govern as a queen, mint coins, and build a library, but she would never return to Egypt. Her brothers, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, simply disappear from the historical record after childhood. No dates of death, no marriages, no graves. They were absorbed into Roman society and erased from the royal lineage. This was the final consequence of Cleopatra's captivity, not her death, but the redirection of her legacy. Rome did not need to erase Cleopatra from history. It needed control which version of her survived, and it succeeded. For 2,000 years, the dominant image of Cleopatra was not the multilingual diplomat who stabilized a collapsing economy. It was not the naval commander who deployed 60 ships at Actium. It was a seductress, the foreign threat, the tragic lover, the woman on the couch with the SP. That version was constructed in Rome, displayed in Rome, and transmitted by Roman historians like Plutarch and Dio Cassius. Even her death became part of the Roman narrative. The ASP, a symbol of Egyptian royalty and divinity, was repurposed as the instrument of her destruction. The story that the pharaoh was killed by her own symbol was too perfect to be accidental. It framed her as theatrical, irrational, and self-destructive. It transformed a calculated political exit into a romantic gesture. Shakespeare immortalized the ASP. Hollywood visualized it. Popular culture repeated it. Cleopatra's final weeks were not a melodrama. They were a process. Surveillance without interrogation. Detention without charge. Time without agency. Roman soldiers did not need to torture her. They simply removed her ability to determine outcomes. Her children survived, but her dynasty did not. Her image endured, but her authority did not. She was preserved in history, but only in the version Rome chose to archive. The woman who spoke 9 languages had no voice in how she was remembered. The ruler who commanded fleets was reduced to a painted statue on a cart. And all of this happened not through violence, but through substitution. Rome did not destroy Cleopatra. It replaced her with an image it could control. History does not always destroy its enemies with the sword. Sometimes it simply files them away.